Hey everyone, I'm Gwen from Nile, and today I want to talk to you about how to use Nile with NextAuth. Nile is serverless Postgres for modern SaaS, and we provide built-in tenant isolation via virtual tenant databases. Since users belong to tenants, Nile can easily enforce access controls. A user that belongs to a specific tenant has the ability to connect to the virtual tenant database of that specific tenant and see data that belongs to the tenant. If a user doesn't belong to the tenant, he cannot do that. This is all great, and Nile provides authentication APIs and it provides components in the SDKs for authentication. We really make using users with tenants in Nile really easy for you. But what if you actually want to use NextAuth and still enjoy all the tenant management features that Nile offers? This is not a problem. It is actually fairly straightforward. I'll show you how I do it. First things first, I'm going to need a database. So let's create one. Now that I have my database, I need to create a bunch of tables for NextAuth to store its information. Nile has built-in tables for user authentication. You can see them in the auth schema and the user schema. We have place for credentials and for OIDC flows. And in users, we have, of course, the users database and the tenant users. But NextAuth requires slightly different tables since it stores slightly different information. So we're going to create the tables for NextAuth, and I'm going to do it in the public schema. I'm going to create a table for accounts. This has information for the external identity providers like Google and GitHub and so on. The next table we're going to add is sessions, because we're going to use session-based authentication in our example. And the last table we're going to introduce is verification token, because we're going to use email-based authentication and we'll need a table to store the tokens that you're going to use to verify your emails. One more bit. Even though we're going to use the built-in users table that is already exists in Nile to store our users, we have an extra column that we're going to need that does not exist in the table. That's email verified, whether the user who used email verification actually verified the email and therefore should be allowed to log in. So let's add the extra column. We didn't really create a table for our data. This is all just for the users and authentication. It's going to be a to-do list application, so let's create a table for my to-dos. Okay, now we have to-dos. And one more thing we need to do before we are leaving the console is to get credentials so we can access the database from our amazing application. So let's go to settings, connection, generate credentials, copy this, and remember, if someone else finds it, they will be able to access your data. So make sure you keep it safely. Time to go and start building our application. And first thing we need to do here is to clone the template. Now I need to set the environment variables. First of all, copy the example to env local. It looks like a lot of environment variables, so let me go over them quickly. Because NextAuth uses anti-CSRF, you need to give it a random string that only you know, and it will be used for your encryption. I'm going to leave it as it is, but don't do the same thing in your production. Next thing, we are going to have in our example two different authentication methods. One is via email. So the user signs up, gets an email, and then clicks on a link in the email in order to log in. And also GitHub authentication. So the user uses their GitHub account to get access. Each one of those methods, and this is true for every method of authentication, will require configuration on your part. For the email authentication, you need to use an email provider. We used Mailgun. You may use Resend or Twilio, SendGrid, all those different email providers. You need to get from that email provider the information that will allow NextAuth to ping the email provider and say, please send an email in my name to that user. So this is what we're going to put here. If you don't want email authentication, no worries, just comment this all out, ignore it, and you can go on with your life. And then the second thing we do is have GitHub Auth. And again, in order to use GitHub Auth, you're going to need to go to the GitHub website and enable GitHub authentication on a project. At the end of the configuration process, it will give you GitHub ID and GitHub secrets that you are supposed to plug in here. So I'm not going to go through all the details of how to set it up, an email service provider, and then how to set up GitHub. You can find it in GitHub and your favorite email provider documentation, or if you're having trouble, NextAuth documentation itself have detailed instructions for both email using, I believe, Resend and for GitHub. So you can also look it up. I'm just going to plug in my numbers over here. Okay, and now you also need details on how to connect to Nile. Those are the ones you just saved when I told you to save the connection string to Nile and generate credentials. So hopefully you still have all those. And then we also want for the APIs, this is important for the client-side components, to have the workspace name and the database name we already had up there. Okay, I think we got our environment variables in place. Now that we did all that, time to get the dependencies with npm install. That was fast. I like it. And run the app. Cross fingers for me that I got all the environment variables correct. Okay, so you can see in my app that I have two authentication methods, sign in with GitHub and sign in with email. Let me show you the sign in with email one. Okay, so I'm going to put in here my email address. Okay, and it says that I got a link. So let me look for the link. Okay, and this is what the email I got looks like. So you can see that it is from Passwordless at no reply Nile demo, because this is how I set up my email account with my email provider. And I can click sign in. You can see that I signed in. This is what my to-do list app look like. I can now create tenants. I have a new tenant, and now I can add to-dos to the tenant. And I can mark stuff as done. And if I want to log out, then I also have a logout option. This is basically what NextAuth gives us. Yeah, and it gives us many built-in authentication methods. I authenticated as a user. Let's take a look at what it looks like in the Nile database at the same time, right? So I'm going back to my database. And first thing, let's take a look at users. And here's the user that I signed up in, and it even says the email is verified and when did it get verified. And because the user created a tenant, I can also go to tenant users and see that the new tenant exists here. And then if I switch back to public and take a look at tenants, I can see new tenant, I can see the to-dos, pretty much what you would expect in a database. Key things you've seen so far. We configured the NextAuth template. We started it up. And when we had a user go and sign up via NextAuth, the user showed up in the Nile database, and when he created a tenant, the tenant and the user were linked, which means that the user now have permissions to create data for the tenant. In this case, it created 2 to-dos and marked one of them as done. Let me show you how I did all that. So I'm going to pull up my code editor and walk you through a few interesting bits. So here we are in code editor in the NextAuth example. To start with, let me show you how I'm setting up NextAuth itself. So I'm going to app API, and you see it has NextAuth and it has routes. This is kind of the catch-all mechanism that NextAuth provides, and really what makes NextAuth so cool. So, the main thing about NextAuth is that it is basically a library that takes a lot of configuration and then does a lot of magic for you. A good place to start looking at it is to see that I'm configuring a bunch of providers. In this case, these are the 2 providers you've seen on the front page. You can add as many providers as you want there. You just need to give each one configuration. You've seen the one I did for email. Most social providers, I'm talking GitHub and Slack and Facebook and Google, and all those will usually give you a pair of ID and secret, and this is what you're going to use. In this case, I wanted to use session-based authentication, and I wanted to store the sessions in my database. So I configured sessions, and I said, please store the sessions in the database. Now I said, please use a database, but I needed not just to use any database, I needed to use Nile. So over here in adapter, I'm saying use the Nile adapter. Now NextAuth has gazillion adapters for gazillion different databases. The Nile adapter is part of this template, and it's basically a small modification on the normal Postgres adapter, except that I introduced Nile's built-in table. So the data about users will actually go into Nile's built-in users table, for example. So I'm passing along my database configuration. The cool thing is that after you do all that, you basically say, I have this handler and please export this handler. And this handler gives you all these routes for sign in, for sign up, signing for each provider that you configure, the callback, because authentication from external providers like GitHub requires this kind of flow where GitHub redirects you to a landing page. NextAuth provides this landing page for us with the callback. All those things just show up. So for me, it was very impressive to see how much work it saves you and how much boilerplate it saves you. So this is really nice. Now in the UI, you can use built-in pages that NextAuth also provides and auto-generates. But it's a matter of taste on whether you like how they look or not. I wanted to style my own page. I had very specific expectations how I wanted to look. So I actually created my own pages and made them call back to all those NextAuth flows that are provided. So let me show you how I did the landing page. The main thing is that I basically have 2 forms here. One of them is a single button. This is the one that says, take me to sign in with GitHub. And the thing that this one does is basically called the signing method. And the signing method is part of NextAuth React package. And I say, okay, I'm signing in with GitHub. NextAuth knows what to do. I don't need to do anything else. It already has all my configuration. It does the magic. And I'm saying, after you are done doing your magic with GitHub, please make sure the users land on /tenants. /tenants is where you have the create tenant button. So this is all I had to do here. Similar thing for the email. Email, I needed to actually get the email. So I have a form. The form has an input field for the email. And again, on submit, only thing I do, I have the email. This is where I'm telling NextAuth, I'm using email authentication here. And then I'm passing in the email address that I just got from the user. And I'm saying again, once you're done doing your thing, sending them an email, getting the verification, I don't know anything about how it does it, by the way, but once it's done doing this, please put them on the tenant page and I continue on. And on the tenant page, I check the token. I know that they're verified. Things are good over there. The last thing I need to do is to make sure that every time I connect to Nile, I pass Nile information about this specific user who just authenticated via NextAuth, and I just created the user in Nile's user database. I'm telling Nile that I'm doing actions as this user and to apply access controls as it applies to this user. So let's see how we do that. The way we use Nile in any page that requires access to tenant database or access controls is that we use configure Nile. If we have a tenant, we pass in a tenant. If we don't, over here we have not created a tenant yet, we just pass in undefined. For example, in the to-do page, I already have a tenant, so I'm configuring Nile with the tenant ID. The thing that configure Nile does is go back and give me a configured connection to my Nile database. And if I passed in a tenant, it is a configured connection to the Nile virtualized tenant database. So this is a connection to a database that only contains data for this tenant, nobody else, and only users with access to this tenant are allowed to actually get this kind of connection. So the only last bit is how do I get the user information to Nile, right? So let me show you how we configure Nile. I'm doing it over here. I have all the Nile configuration. And then when you call configure Nile, I need to figure out the user. So I'm calling get server session. This is all server-side code. And this is, again, a NextAuth magical method. And what this does is bring me a session for the user. And I can use this session to get the user ID. And if the user is not authenticated, this session is not going to exist. This is where I trust NextAuth to do this job for me. I'm getting the user ID and I'm telling Nile, this user ID needs to access this tenant, and Nile may say, sorry, cannot do it. This user ID doesn't have access to this tenant. Or, as hopefully happens, it will say, fantastic, here is a connection to your virtual tenant database for this user. I've already verified that the user is allowed to access, and I don't have to worry about anything. It makes life really easy for you. NextAuth handles a lot. And as you can see, it's really well integrated with Nile. All the users are stored in your Nile database, not in a third-party database anywhere. You don't pay anything for those users to anyone. NextAuth is open source. Nile does not charge by the number of users you're going to have. You can have as many providers as you want. NextAuth does 90% of the magic and heavy lifting for you. Nile does the other 90% of the magic and heavy lifting when it comes to tenant isolation, security, and access controls. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to Nile and NextAuth. If you enjoyed it, I recommend, as next step, clone the repo, play with the example, maybe add providers of your choice, maybe copy-paste the relevant parts and put them in your application. Join our Discord. Tell us how it went. Did you create an app? Is it cool? Show us the app. Did you fail? Tell us what happened. We are there to help out, answer any questions, and make sure that your SaaS is going to be amazingly successful.